Register. Hello, everyone. Today we have the immense pleasure to have with us Matteo Bonotti, who is going to present his latest co-authored paper, and we look forward to listening to his presentation and to giving hopefully useful and helpful feedback. Of course, let me say a couple of things about Matteo before starting. He is a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Monash University. But prior to joining Monash, he was a lecturer at the Cardiff University, at the Queen's University in Belfast, and at the University of Edinburgh. His research interest cover a very broad, I would say, spectrum of fields. Indeed, our instance, they just edited them in this book. Actually, this was published a couple of years ago, right? But it's still very recent, and this is a book on free speech, accredited with Jonathan Siglow, and published by Polity. And his papers have been published in the top journals. I want to just mention here the American the Political Science Review, and the Journal of Politics, and the Journal of Common Market Studies. So it's a great honor for us, to have you here, Matteo. I'm very happy that you immediately accepted our invitation. Having said that, without further ado, I give you the floor. And I know that you have a PowerPoint presentation, so we're gonna share it. And this way also the friends who are online, will be able to follow your presentation. Here we go, ready where you are.
Okay. Thank you very much, Giuseppe. I hope everyone at home can see the slides. Here, I'm sure you can. So thank you for the nice introduction and invitation. It's a very nice campus and nice institution here. And thank you for everyone who is taking the time to attend the talk in person or online. So this paper is co-authored with my collaborator Zim Okora, who's based at Deakin University, which is also in Melbourne, like Monash, my institution. It is a paper, of course, but it's also part of a broader project of a book that Zim and I have been working on for a while, and which we are planning to finalize by the end of the year. So any feedback that you have, even if for any reason there's no way of including in the paper, due to space constraints, will be very important and useful for us as we continue to develop our book. So please be as critical as you can. It would be very, very useful for us if you raise questions, challenges, and comments. So what's the purpose? What was the goal of this paper? Well, the paper, as the title says, focuses on political finance, which, quite surprisingly, it's a topic which has not been studied as much as one would expect by political theorists, including by political theorists who are interested in parties. The problem central to the paper is a normative one. So when a state, when a country wants to reform its political finance systems, on which grounds, on which values, on which normative goals and principles should these reforms be based? And our central argument in a nutshell is that political finance arrangements, political finance reforms cannot be implemented independently from an assessment of the party system of that specific country. And more specifically, they cannot be implemented, they should be implemented in a way that counterbalances the pathology or the problematic tendencies that characterize the specific party system of that specific country. So it's a very contextualist approach. And we defend this argument in 3 steps in the paper. First, we illustrate, we develop our normative framework, which is what we call the normative theory of partisanship. I'll come back to this in a second. Second, we apply this normative theory of partisanship with its key goals and normative principles to party systems first, more specifically 3 types of party systems, and then to 5 different models of political finance. And these are obviously idealized versions of party systems and political finance models. And finally, we define what we call the civic model of political finance, which is basically a set of combinations of party system and political finance model, which we think best realize the normative goals of partisanship, of the normative theory of partisanship. So hopefully all of this will become clear as I speak. So what's this normative theory of partisanship? Now, I don't know how familiar you are here with this literature, but I don't know, as you know, party politics, political parties, sorry, have been extensively studied in political finance, in political science, especially, but not only by comparative political scientists. But quite strangely, political theorists have neglected political parties for a long time. There's also been a sort of hostility towards political parties by political theorists and philosophers until recently, until about 10-15 years ago, when a number of theorists started to work on parties, to normatively evaluate parties and normatively highlight their contribution, the positive contribution to democracy. The first important volume on this topic was by Nancy Rosenblum at Harvard in 2008, On the Side of the Angels, followed by other important works by Jonathan Y. and Lea Uppi on the meaning of partisanship, 2016, also work by Fabio Falkenstein, Russell Muirhead. I myself have contributed to this literature with a book on partisanship, and John Rawls's Political Liberalism, which adopts a narrower approach, but still tries to show that parties can be conducive to democratic well-being in many ways. So here, with Zim, with my co-author, we try to synthesize this body of work by identifying 2 main normative dimensions, which bring together these different sources and accounts of partisanship, which have developed over the past 15 years. And we identify 2 main dimensions, normative dimensions, along which we think parties are desirable. So the first is a sort of horizontal dimension, which we call collegiality. So the idea here, which, as I said, tries to bring together claims made across this normative literature about parties, is that parties are good, parties at their best, so ideal parties, if you want, parties that really fulfill their role, are positive, are desirable in a democracy, because, or insofar as they engage in collegial relationships with each other. So, insofar as they abide by norms on non-violence, legitimate opposition, regulated rivalry, but also insofar as they behave civilly towards each other, and also insofar as they contribute to public justification. This is the idea that parties and partisans should not just implement laws based on power or majority rule, but they should try to justify their proposed policies by appealing to the public good. They should provide a public justification for their policies. These are all normative claims which have been made at different points in this literature, which we all summarize through this idea of collegiality. So collegiality is the desirable horizontal dimension of the normative theory of partisanship. Alongside this collegial horizontal dimension, there's a vertical dimension. Here, the idea is that parties are good for democracy insofar as they provide a linkage between citizens and the state. Desirable parties, or parties at their best, are those that provide a linkage between citizens and the state. And the linkage, here in this paper, we break it down into 2 main components. The first is what we call voice. So here the idea is that the first step of linkage is that if you have demands, interest among citizens in a society, systemic voice, so voice across the party system, is realized when all, or at least most citizens can find their views, their demands reflected at least one party's manifestos and platform across the party system, or perhaps in more than one. But the idea is that the party system and the manifestos of the various parties in the system should reflect the demands and interests present across the population, proportionally, of course. But that's just the first step of linkage. There's a second step, because imagine, now, parties can obviously design and write manifestos which take into account citizens' demands, but then they may decide not to do anything about those demands. No, we witness that problem all the time. No, pledges remain unfulfilled, to use the terminology used by a certain strand of political science. So the second step of linkage is systemic accountability, which involves two elements in our view. One is uptake. So parties perform full linkage by and therefore contribute to systemic accountability if they implement the policies that they have proposed in the manifestos, or if they're not empowered, they carry out opposition based on those pledges, or simply express those pledges in parliament during debates. And I imagine a Green Party who was unlikely to ever be in power in a two-party system. They may still not perform a lot of expressive uptake if they constantly voice their instances, their demands, and those of their constituents in parliament. And obviously, uptake is tightly linked to sanctions, which is another key element of accountability. Now, we think that you're likely to witness more uptake across the party system the more parties across the system are subject to sanctions, formal or informal, which incentivize them to perform the uptake. Now, if a party or parties, if an MP is scared of not being re-elected, for example, it's more likely that they will try to fulfill their pledges after elected. Otherwise, they might risk not being re-elected next time. So this is the normative theory of partisanship. So this is just a table that gives you a snapshot of the theory with its two main dimensions and then the various sub-dimensions. Okay, so what do we do with this? So first, we use this framework to carry out a normative evaluation of three main types of party systems. Now, this is admittedly a very idealized picture of party system types, but it's one that draws on the work of classic authors like especially Giovanni Sertori, with whom many of you will be familiar. And we focus only on three types of party systems: concentrated party systems, moderate pluralist systems, and polarized pluralist systems. And here, by concentrated party system, we really just mean a two-party system, even though the category concentrated also involves really so-called predominant party systems, where there's a party in power for a long time, like in Japan, for example, or in India at the time of the Indian National Congress. But here we focus on two-party systems, such as those that we find in Australia, the UK, the US. Of course, some of these judgments can be contested, especially by the UK, perhaps. Now, some would say it's no longer a two-party system, but traditionally it has been a two-party system with two major parties, a kind of winner-takes-all logic, very high stakes, because the winner takes everything, really. It can govern normally without need to enter coalition with other parties, with a famous exception in the UK in 2010, when the Conservatives had to join the Liberal Democratic Party to form a government, but normally that's not the norm in those kind of systems. And normally what produces a two-party system is a majoritarian electoral system. Now, we think that this kind of party system, it's low in terms of collegiality, precisely because of the winner-takes-all logic, the high stakes, which really creates a very conflictual inter-party relationship between the various parties. So there's a low incentive for cooperation across partisan lines, also a low justificatory pressure, so a low incentive for whoever is in power to engage in public justification. The party in power can simply say, we won, we'll implement this law. There's not much pressure for them to try to justify the law based on the public good, on the interest also of those who have voted for other parties. Simply because once you won, you can pretty much do anything within, of course, certain constitutional boundaries and so on. In terms of systemic voice, this type of party system, we think is also low, presents a low level of systemic voice, because even though citizens are quite close to MPs, because the electoral system normally employed is a majoritarian one with single-member constituencies, at the same time, the main parties in the system, the two main parties, tend to be big tent or catch-all parties, which tend to dilute the voice of citizens. And there's, as a result, also disproportionate voice across the system, because while those who voted for the two main parties may see themselves represented, there are limits to that because of this dilution of voice, many other people will feel unrepresented by those parties, and they will not have really suitable parties for which support and to see their voice and their demands expressed, which is one of the main problems with this kind of party system. But in terms of systemic accountability within the concentrated party system is quite good, it's quite high performing, because the single member districts, which are normally characteristics of this party system type, provide strong electoral sanctions for MPs. You will be punished if you don't perform, if you don't fulfill your pledges, and therefore MPs will be held accountable by citizens, by constituents, and that normally applies to all parties across the system. Now, if we move to the moderate pluralist party system type, what we find in Germany, that's the classic example, the German party system. Here we normally have 3 to 5 relevant parties, so parties that can actually be in government to influence government. The stakes are more moderate than the concentrated system. There's greater ideological spread, so it's not that all the parties converge towards the center. And not very important aspect, there are normally coalition governments. No party can govern on its own. This kind of system is normally produced by a proportional electoral system. Within this kind of party system is very collegial, because they need to form coalitions, coalitions which tend to be stable over time. So normally parties join coalitions with the same parties over time, helps them to develop relationships of trust, collegiality, compromise, and so on. And also, the greater number of parties in the system provides a higher justificatory pressure on the party in power, because if you are in power with other parties, as a member of a coalition, you need to really justify your proposed policies to your coalition partners, but also to the many other parties in the system, in the party system in parliament. And there are many more parties than the concentrated system. In terms of systemic voice, the presence of more parties increases systemic voice across the system. More citizens can have their demands reflected by the various parties' manifestos. But at the same time, there's a distance between citizens and MPs, because normally there are no single member districts here. Normally you vote for a party list, and you don't have that direct relationship with MP that you find in a two-party system, in a concentrated system. So it's a medium level of voice. And likewise, we think there's a medium level of systemic accountability, because the multi-member districts characteristic of the system, in a sense, provide protection for MPs. Now, if you are, imagine you are an MP, you haven't performed very well over the past 5 years in parliament, yet your party can protect you. They can put you at the top of the party list and prevent you from being punished by voters. So accountability is lower than the concentrated system. But at the same time, the fact that there are recurring party blocks, stable governments, still provides a degree of accountability, because you know that if citizens decide not to vote for a certain party, it's likely that the coalition to which the party normally belongs will not probably be able to form a government again. If many citizens do that, the party and therefore the coalition will be punished. And finally, we look at polarized pluralism, which is, if you want, an extreme version of moderate pluralism with a higher number of parties. Very low electoral stakes, mainly because what happens after elections is often more important than what happens at the elections, because the system is so volatile that sometimes a party may end up being in government, in a coalition government, even though they didn't perform very well at the election. And why? Because their votes, their seats in parliament are necessary for a certain coalition government. There's a higher ideological spread with more extremes, and the coalition governments are normally more volatile than in the moderate pluralist system. This system too is normally a result of proportional electoral systems. Here within the collegialities of medium level, because there's a high justificatory pressure coming from all the many parties in parliament, but the irregular volatile coalition formulas means that there's a lesser tradition of coalition building, engagement with the same coalition partners over time, fewer repeat interactions, and also there's a thin common ground between parties due to the ideological spread, the polarized nature of the system. Within the systemic voice is high because there are so many parties in which citizens can recognize themselves and in whose manifestos the demands can be reflected. And also, because there are so many parties, there are greater opportunities for citizens to be in touch with representatives from some of these parties. Also, the fact that the system is volatile means that parties can very much cater for their core constituents, they don't need to be worried about not advancing claims or platforms which may alienate other parties, because here you need to maximize your support at the election time, and then you can use the support at the bargaining time post-elections to participate, to try to join a coalition government. So there's not focus on long-term strategy, but on short-term strategy, and therefore this creates more scope for being responsive to citizens and parties' manifestos. And finally, though, we think that the system is low in terms of systemic accountability, because as in the case of moderate pluralism, the multi-member nature of electoral districts helps MPs, helps parties to insulate MPs from punishment, from sanctioning. And more generally, the fact, as I said earlier, that what happens after elections is somehow more important than what happens at the election time because of the bargaining that goes on to form coalitions. That means that it's not easy for citizens to punish a party, because you can decide not to vote for a party, but the party might still be able to join a government because their 5% counts more at this time, counts more than the 10% 5 years ago, because of how the other parties have performed the same elections. So it's very unpredictable. It's difficult for citizens to predict under which circumstances a party will or will not be member of a coalition. So there's slow accountability across the system. And this gives you a snapshot of these evaluations. All these evaluations, especially for those of you who had the chance to read the paper, but if you haven't, just let me know, I can share it with you. Of course, conjectures, hypotheses, but also based on empirical evidence about the working of these different party systems. So it's not that just based on abstract thought, but they're supported by empirical evidence about these different party system types. So that's the first step of the paper. We evaluate party system types based on the normative theory of partisanship. The second step is to evaluate different political finance models based on the normative theory of partisanship. We first consider state-based political finance. Here we idealize, we assume that all the money, all the funding for parties comes from the state. That's not the reality in most cases, because there will often be a mix of private funding, state funding, but we idealize in order to carry out our normative assessment. So when all the funding comes from the state, we think that that's conducive to high collegiality, because parties don't have to fight for money. Normally, fighting for money creates a arms race, a financial arms race, which is not conducive to collegial relationships. So if you remove the rationale for the arms race, that we think that will encourage more collegial inter-party relationships. Likewise, we think the systemic voice is high, because especially when you have an inclusive state funding system in which the threshold for obtaining state fund is low, that will make it very easy for parties to be formed, and therefore citizens will have the chance to form and vote for parties that can reflect their demands, and therefore systemic voice will be clear and proportional across the system. And finally, systemic accountability, we think that will be low, because here parties are not really accountable to anyone specifically. They are not accountable to voters, to any private financiers, because they receive money directly from the state, even though there's some degree of indirect accountability in those cases in which state funding depends on electoral performance, which is not always the case. But if a party needs to achieve a percentage X of votes or seats in order to qualify for voting, then of course citizens can punish them by not voting for the party, because that will also affect the degree of funding, the level of funding that they obtain. But generally, we think it's fairly low accountability. In the case of private political finance, here we assume, for the sake of argument, a system in which there are no caps, okay, and therefore where there's a chance for large, wealthy donors to play a key role in the system without being constrained by caps on donations. We think that the system is very low in terms of collegiality, for reasons that you can understand. Now, when there are a few wealthy donors, fat cats, which influence the party system, that's not very conducive to collegiality. Parties will try to fight for these private resources, and these fat cats will try to influence the parties' manifestos, platforms, and so on. Not good for collegiality. Partial interest will be promoted instead. Systemic voice will also be low, because while the voice of the few wealthy donors will be reflected in party manifestos and so on, many citizens will be excluded from voice, assuming a certain degree of inequality, which is characteristic of most liberal democracies. And finally, within accountability, systemic accountability will also be low for similar reasons. Parties will feel that they're accountable to the wealthy donors, to the few wealthy donors that voted and that supported them, but not to most citizens, most other citizens who have not had the chance to influence them or support them through their funding. So there will be a capture by a privileged few, which is not good for accountability across the system. We then consider a mixed type, one which is an idealized system in which 50% of funding comes from the state, 50 from private donors, FACATs, and the evaluation is simply based on combining the evaluations of the private and state systems. So there would be medium collegiality, medium systemic voice, and low systemic accountability. But more interesting are two additional mixed types that we consider. The first is a voucher system, which has been promoted and proposed by Ackerman and Ayers in this book by 2004, and then implemented in various places, especially in the US and Seattle, among others. This is a system in which the state provides citizens, each citizen, with vouchers. Could be one, could be a few. I think in Seattle it was 4 vouchers per citizen. And then the citizen can decide how to redistribute those vouchers across the different parties. We think that this system is good for collegiality because it helps to create a more diverse parliament. As in the case of state funding, there's not really financial arms race, and the proliferation of parties that is likely to arise from the system will increase justificatory pressure, so promote public justification. Also, we think that the system will create high systemic voice because it will be easy for citizens to form parties or support parties without having to worry about financial resources, and therefore voice will be clear and proportional across the system. And likewise, systemic accountability will be high because citizens will have 2 tools to hold parties and partisans accountable: their vote and their state-funded voucher. So they can punish, they have more nuanced tools for punishing parties that don't perform. And finally, the last model we consider is an anonymized donation system, which is a system in which the money comes from private citizens, but doesn't go directly to parties. It goes either to an electoral commission that redistributes it to the parties for which the donors want the money to be sent, or some kind of blind trust, or some kind of institution or body that ensures that the donations remain anonymized. In the system, we think the collegiality is high because funding is private, it's coming from private sources, but the disruption of the connection between the donors and the recipients prevents, or at least should prevent, in principle, if the system works properly, should prevent the partial interest of donors influence the parties and the partisans. Systemic voice is medium because, of course, this is still a private system, and unless there are caps, it is likely that some people, some anonymous donors, wealthy ones, will be more able and more capable of funding parties, and therefore those parties will succeed more than parties that receive fewer donations. But at least the idea is that anonymization will hopefully reduce the influence that these wealthier donors can have on party manifestos and party policies. And finally, within the accountability, systemic accountability is low because the system is anonymous, and therefore it's not clear to whom parties are accountable when it comes to donations. But at least this is not an imbalanced kind of accountability like you find in the normal private system, where parties really are captured by a wealthy few, but they are unaccountable to other citizens. So this is a summary of these evaluations of different political finance models based on the normative theory of partisanship. And to conclude, I will talk about the civic model of political finance, which is basically the stage where we bring together the 2 sets of evaluations of party system types of political finance models. And we consider the so-called civic model of political finance, the set of political finance party system combinations that helps reduce the pathologies of a party system. We call it civic model, just to let you know, based on Almond Verba's famous account of the civic political culture, where they imagine the civic political culture as a political culture that combines elements of parochial, three types of political cultures which present different shortcomings, and the civic political culture helps to realize a balanced set of normative goals. But we use the term just to describe what you think is an ideal arrangement in which political finance and party system helps to achieve ideal levels of collegiality and systemic linkage, so systemic voice and systemic accountability. There are situations in which you have a perfect balance, so the political finance model perfectly balances the party system by compensating for its pathologies, for example. Other situations in which there's only a weak balance, so the political finance model only partially offsets, compensates for the shortcomings of the party system. But whether it's balanced or weakly balanced, a combination is an expression of what we call the civic model of political finance. What emerges from our picture, I will show you a table in a minute, is that there are while there are complementary political finance arrangements for concentrated party systems, there are not perfectly complementary arrangements for moderate and polarized pluralism. But we don't think that that's a problem, because the main goal of our account is to guide policymakers and those who engage in the reform of political finance, guide them to stay away from pathological scenarios. So from those situations in which political finance can exacerbate the shortcomings and weaknesses of a party system based on the normative theory of partisanship. So this kind of color-coded table will hopefully give you an idea of what I'm talking about. And also, we try to identify specific countries which, because of the party system and because of the kind of political finance arrangement present in them, approximate kind of the ideal type, the ideal combinations that we talk about in the abstract. We couldn't find specific countries for all different boxes, but for most of them. So to give you an idea, state-based finance or the voucher scheme or the anonymous donation schemes had to fully compensate for the shortcomings of concentrated two-party systems, and therefore they produce a balanced outcome. In other cases, now you will have a weakly balanced outcome. For example, for moderate pluralism, having private-based finance and mixed public-private finance can at least create a weakly balanced scenario. And for polarized pluralism, only the anonymous donation scheme can avoid pathological outcomes. And one thing I need to stress is that it's important to remember that it's not only when you have too little and insufficient level of a dimension of the normative theory of partisanship that there's a problem. So it's not only when there's not enough collegiality that you have a problem, when there's not enough voice, but also when you have too much collegiality or too much voice, because when you have an excessively collegial system, you end up with a cartelized scenario, which is what we find, for example, in a country like Belgium. And a cartelized system is one in which the parties have become so cozy towards each other and so detached from the people, from citizens, that that's not good from a democratic perspective. It's not good from the perspective of the normative theory of partisanship, because you're losing a lot of linkage now from citizens. Here, your parties are just catering for their own interests. Likewise, it's not, while of course it's a problem to have little voice, insufficient levels of voice, when parties don't listen to citizens enough, don't design their manifestos in ways which sufficiently take into account people's demands. It's also a problem when parties try to be too sensitive to people's demands, because that can be conducive to inaction, to their inability to deal with important public policy problems. So you have a hypersensitive system where parties are trying to reflect too many citizens' demands, and that can lead to problems of various types, their inability to really engage in effective public policy. So it's important to remember this point, not to understand why we characterize as pathological scenarios in which you have very high levels of collegiality, systemic voice, or systemic accountability, as well as those in which there are very low levels of these three properties. Okay, so I think I'll stop here. I might leave this table up there because we can refer to it, but I conclude here. So thank you in advance for any questions. Thank you.